This is another recipe in the Guerrilla Cooking series. Now, I just did a recipe on pickle soup, a World War I recipe that came from a cookbook that was issued to the Imperial German Army, printed in 1915. Well, also mentioned on the website that has the translations from that cookbook, it has sauerkraut soup right after it. And it says that prepare it the exact same as the pickle soup, but substitute sauerkraut for pickle. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through with this sauerkraut soup. I'm actually going to prepare it more along the lines of what was made traditionally in the area where I grew up. There are tons of different recipes for sauerkraut soup. Some of them are creamy, some of them are liquidy, some of them are ask for like half of the contents of the soup as sauerkraut, and others say that it's supposed to be mostly other veggies. You get the idea. There's tons of variations. This is just one variation that can be done. Now, some of you will point out that this is going to be really close to a recipe I did early in the series, kraut and pork. Yes, it is. It's going to be very close to that. Now, what we're going to need for this, some sauerkraut, figure 1 small can. 1 small can of Spam. 1 tablespoon of fat, and I will be using bacon grease again, and 2 tablespoons of flour. For those of you that are catching this, I am cutting the amount of thickener material in half for this recipe. Like I said, this was the common variation in the area I grew up. It was a creamy type soup, but it was thinner. So what we're going to do first here, we're going to get started. We're going to bring over our electric fire. Now I'm not going to open up my can. I'm going to use what's left, about the same amount of homemade sauerkraut for this one. Because I had just enough left in the jar I was using the past couple days for this recipe. It's about the same amount as the can. Now I'm going to add some water. We're going to add about 1 pint's worth of water into this. If you're doing this for yourself in a canteen cup, remember, just cut back on the amount of ingredients. But the amount I'm giving you, this really should be a mess kit item. Now we're going to prep our pork, and the pork I am going to use for this one will be Spam. And the reason I'm using Spam, well, it's canned, it has a nice long shelf life. You can carry it inside your rucksack in the field. And depending on the temperature of storage at your retreat, you can store it at your retreat waiting for you. Okay, we'll get that going, quote unquote, over my fire here. Now I'm going to start prepping my thickening agent. So for my thickening agent, I'm going to need about 1 tablespoon or 1 spoon of fat. We have to melt the fat completely before we start adding in the flour. Now, just some notes for variations while we're getting this stuff starting to work here. Pork was very common for adding to sauerkraut soup where I grew up. There are vegetarian versions. Now, where I grew up, the most common items that were added into sauerkraut soup were just general pork, like from a pork roast or pork chops cut up, or ham or sausage, especially some type of smoked sausage. Other items that you can add, especially in the field, would be Spam or bacon, as long as it's some type of pork product. Now, could you add something other than pork in this? Yes, you can. It's going to be your personal preference. Like I said, there's tons of different variations of this out there. One thing I came across is a Polish version of sauerkraut soup. And just like with pickle soup, it said to add potatoes, carrots, and onion. Tons of different variations. Use what you have available to you. Now we'll start adding in some of the flour. I have approximately 1 tablespoon worth of fat, adding in 2 tablespoons of flour to create our roux, which will be our thickening agent. Now, you don't have to add a roux or cream type agent into this recipe if you don't want to. As I said, there's tons of variations, and there are variations where the only thing you add is water, or maybe you use a little bit of broth. After we get our roux made here, get our flour and fat combined, we will add it to our soup. Now, in case you missed the pickled soup recipe, you skipped it. Traditionally, a roux is made 1-for-1. So 1 part flour for every 1 part of fat. The World War I cookbook I am going off of called for a 2-for-1. 2 parts flour for every 1 part fat. Now I'm going to add a bit more water here. We'll see how thick it gets here as it heats up. Now I would recommend, if you're out in the forest, out in the woods, up in the mountains, and you're making this as part of your survival meal, add what you have. Okay, if you can get some wild edibles to add more to this, some additional veggies, a different type of meat like squirrel or venison, whatever you have available, go ahead. The main ingredient in sauerkraut soup is obviously sauerkraut. And when you put the sauerkraut in, you also add in the brine with it that's in the kraut. Most of the brine I had left in the jar from this batch of sauerkraut I had used earlier today. So right now, we can just let that sit and heat up. Should not take too long. Now I did do a video a while ago and had posted it on Patreon when I had a Patreon account on how to can your own sauerkraut. I showed my steps, the particular recipe I follow. I showed how to set up the cabbage, get it ready to start fermentation, what to look for and that stuff. If you check through my videos, it's very likely you will find it. I might actually put the link for it in the description here in case you want to see about making your own kraut. Now, if you make your own kraut, you do still have to go through and can it up so that you stop the fermentation process. If you do not can it, after you put it inside the jars, you will still get mold growth on top of your cabbage. You're basically just continuing the process of what was happening inside the crock. Now, if that happens, you have a jar of kraut that develops this mold over the top. It's kind of a bluish type color is what I've seen, a grayish to bluish type color. Just scrape that off and any pieces of kraut that's immediately underneath it. Scrape that off, send it out to your garden. Everything below that is just fine. You can still eat it. Just go through and cook it. But you can eat kraut while it's still raw, uncooked. But it's just preferred long-term storage. You're trying to get it to last a while in your survival pantry. Can it. When you're canning it, you're heating it up to a high enough temperature to stop the fermentation process, to stop that mold growth. I'm trying to get as much of the roux out of here as possible. You don't want to waste anything when you're in the field if possible. Just going to let that heat up and boil a bit. And then I will serve it up for me and Combat Cameraman here. So, for carrying with you in the field, I did a video on this already. These small cans of kraut really come in handy. Just keep them from freezing. And if they do freeze, open them up and use them pretty quickly. Because when they defrost, you run the risk that the cans could burst. Typically what I did when I was still in the military, once we got to winter any canned items I had inside my rucksack or a salt pack, I would pull those out and I would eat them. Even up in the barracks, I'd heat them up and get them eaten. And I would replace those items with dry goods of some type, like freeze-dried pouches. Once we got back into springtime, that's when I would go back over to the commissary or the shopette, and I would start looking for those canned items again to add back into my bags for over the warm weather months. When I went to the desert, I did not carry any canned goods inside my bag at that point, just because of the temperature in the summertime in the desert. You're talking 120 some degrees, and that can cause problems with canned goods. So I didn't carry too many canned goods there. I did during the early spring, during fall and winter. I usually had, like one or two that I would get a hold of or have sent to me, but during summer I didn't. So and I think we'll say that this is probably ready, because these items are already cooked. Now, if you're going to do this with fresh ingredients, obviously fresh pork, go through, cook that up thoroughly before you start putting everything in the pot to make soup out of it. Now, the thickness that I grew up with in my area for sauerkraut soup, it was creamed, like I said, but it was runny. It wasn't a super thick cream sauce, if you think of along the lines of a stew. It was runnier. So here you go. Here's sauerkraut soup. I'm not going to say it's sauerkraut soup Security Guy 42 version, because when I do it, I typically do it with sausage or ham. So pass that off to combat cameraman here. Oh, I should mention, add salt and pepper to taste. Typically when it comes to sauerkraut soup, have a small spoon of it and then see if you want to add anything to it. Combat cameraman's trying his. I'll try a little bit, see if I want to add anything. For mine, I am going to add a little bit of salt and pepper. But let's see if thumbs up, thumbs down, combat cameraman, we get a thumbs up. And I knew we would, because this is a recipe I've made personally, and I've shared some of it with him to take home, and I know he likes it. So here you go, sauerkraut soup. Modify it to what you have and your personal tastes. If you want it watery, you want it creamy, you want it super creamy, you want it light creamy, the type of meat you want in it, or you want vegetarian without meat, do whatever you want with whatever you have available. This is a meal that will help you with your digestion. It will help clean you out if you're stopped up, especially if you're not used to eating sauerkraut. Now, for all my engineer brothers in the Patriot and militia movements, always remember essay-ons.